splash I see! You absolute maniac!
Do you know who this is?
Get back here!
He deliberately splashed mud on his ex-wife with his car, unaware she was now a mayor's wife. He slowed down just enough to make sure the mud hit her. Not an accident. Not a mistake. A deliberate splash, dirty water exploding across her clothes as his car sped past. He smiled to himself. His ex-wife, the woman he once discarded like nothing, standing by the roadside, drenched, humiliated, forgotten. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to look so calm. And she definitely wasn't supposed to lift her head and meet his eyes without shame. What he didn't know, what no one bothered to tell him, was that the woman he tried to disgrace was no longer alone, no longer powerless, no longer his victim. The mud on her dress would dry, but the truth he was about to discover would stain his life forever. Because the woman he just humiliated was now the wife of a man who could end him with a single phone call. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ocean of Tales. Kindly watch, comment, and subscribe on this channel. We will be grateful if you help us do this. We will be notifying you when we drop a new video. Don't forget to tell us where you are watching from. Before we move to the main story, if today is your first time of watching our video, please subscribe. The car slowed down just before the puddle, tires whispering against the wet Lagos road as morning traffic hummed behind it. Sunlight reflected off muddy water pooled from last night's rain, brown and thick like something waiting to be used. His foot pressed the brake with intention, not caution. The engine dipped, the steering adjusted slightly, and the timing became precise. This wasn't a mistake born of speed or distraction. This was control returning to his hands. And as the car surged forward again, the splash rose violently into the air, racing toward the woman standing by the roadside, sealing a moment that could never be taken back. The mud hit her with a dull, heavy sound, splattering across her dress, her arms, her shoes, clinging to fabric and skin like a stain that wanted to stay. Drops slid slowly down her sleeves, dripping onto the cracked pavement below. Cars nearby honked and passed, unconcerned, while the smell of wet earth mixed with exhaust fumes. Inside the car, his grip on the steering wheel tightened as satisfaction curled quietly in his chest. He didn't look away. He watched through the side mirror, waiting for the reaction he felt entitled to: shock, anger, collapse. But what he saw instead unsettled him, even if he didn't yet understand why. She didn't scream. She didn't curse. She didn't run after the car waving her arms like someone desperate to be seen. She simply stood there, mud dripping, shoulders still, head lifting slowly as her eyes followed the car's retreating shape. Her calm didn't match the violence of what had just happened, and that mismatch lingered in the air like a question left unanswered. Inside the car, his smile faltered for a second, then returned, forced and thin. He told himself silence meant defeat, but a quiet part of him wondered. Why didn't she react the way broken people usually do? The road itself seemed to stretch longer than usual as he drove on, palm trees blurring past, street vendors calling out prices, Lagos life moving forward without pause. His chest felt light, almost relieved, as if he had just completed unfinished business. In his mind, she was still his ex-wife, the woman he had left crying in an empty flat, the woman who had begged him to reconsider, the woman whose life he believed had stalled the moment he walked away. That splash felt like punctuation, a final reminder of where she stood in the world. Or so he believed, unaware that he might have just underlined the wrong sentence. Behind him, she wiped mud from her face slowly, not with panic, but with care, brushing it away like dust that didn't belong. Her breath came steady, measured, the way it does when someone has already survived worse things in private. The city noise continued around her. Engines revving, people talking, a bus conductor shouting destinations, but none of it reached her fully. Her thoughts were elsewhere, moving backward and forward at the same time, touching old pain and something newer, stronger, still forming. That roadside was not just where she was humiliated. It was where something hardened quietly inside her. As he merged into traffic, his phone buzzed in the cup holder, vibrating softly against plastic. He ignored it, still riding the small high of dominance, replaying the splash in his mind like a scene worth savoring. He didn't notice the way his heartbeat quickened for no clear reason, or how his jaw clenched when the image of her calm face returned uninvited. He told himself it meant nothing. People like her stayed small. People like him moved on. Yet the city seemed unusually watchful, buildings standing tall and silent, as if Lagos itself had seen moments like this before and remembered how they usually end. Far behind him, the mud began to dry on her clothes, cracking slightly under the rising heat. What he didn't know, what no one had told him yet, was that this single act of cruelty had crossed an invisible line. Not a legal one, not a public one, but a moral line that had consequences already in motion. As traffic swallowed his car completely, the question lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved. What kind of man deliberately humiliates someone he believes has nothing left, and what happens when he's wrong? The memory of her tears still lived comfortably in his mind as he drove deeper into Lagos, past glass front offices and half-finished buildings reaching for the sky. He remembered the way her shoulders had collapsed the day he packed his things, how her hands trembled as she tried to speak, how her voice cracked under the weight of disbelief. Those images had become proof to him, evidence that he had won. Every successful man, he believed, left something broken behind. And she, in his story, was the casualty that justified his growth. That certainty wrapped around him now like armor, blinding him to anything that didn't fit the narrative he'd rehearsed for years. He had told people she was weak, that she depended on him too much, that marriage had slowed him down, and he had simply chosen progress over pity. The lies slid easily from his mouth back then, smooth and believable, especially to those who already respected his confidence. He watched friends nod in agreement, watched her name shrink in conversations until it carried no weight at all. To him, reputation was power, and he had stripped hers away piece by piece. What he never stopped to consider was how survival changes a person when they are forced to rebuild without witnesses. As traffic thickened near the bridge, his thoughts drifted back to the early days of their marriage, when she laughed freely and spoke about plans with hope in her voice. He dismissed those memories quickly, annoyed by their persistence. That woman, he told himself, no longer existed. Life had taught her her place. A woman abandoned doesn't rise. She adapts. She endures. That was how the world worked. And yet, something about the way she had stood there, silent, steady, unmoving, refused to align with the version of her he carried in his head. Across the city, she boarded a bus without rushing, choosing a seat by the window as mud-stained fabric brushed against worn vinyl. The bus lurched forward, Port Harcourt bound, its engine growling low as if echoing the weight in her chest. She watched Lagos slide away, street by street, not with longing, but with detachment. This city had taken things from her and taught her lessons she never asked for. She didn't cry now because crying had already done its work. What remained was clarity, and a quiet understanding that pain, when survived, rewrites a person from the inside out. The road stretched long and uneven, sunlight flashing through trees, casting patterns across her face. She replayed moments he believed defined her, her begging, her fear, her collapse, but she saw them differently now. Those moments were not endings. They were costs, and she had paid them in full. Each lie he spread, each friend who turned away, each door that closed had forced her to learn how to stand alone. Strength didn't arrive loudly. It arrived through exhaustion, through nights where survival was the only goal. And somewhere along that road, she had stopped needing his acknowledgement. Back in Lagos, he parked outside a cafe, stepping out with the easy confidence of someone who had never been humbled. The world responded the way it always did. Waiters attentive, strangers respectful, doors opening before he reached them. This was the life, he believed, proved him right. The idea that she could exist beyond his shadow felt absurd to him, almost insulting. In his mind, she was frozen in the past, still standing where he left her. He didn't know that the image he carried was outdated, already false, already dangerous. As he sat down and checked his phone at last, unread notifications stacked quietly on the screen. Names he hadn't expected. Messages he didn't open. A faint unease brushed against his thoughts, quickly dismissed. He had built his identity on certainty, and certainty doesn't ask questions. But somewhere between Lagos and Port Harcourt, between the woman he thought he destroyed and the man he believed himself to be, a gap was widening. And in that gap, the truth was waiting, patient, silent, and far more powerful than he imagined. The divorce papers slid across the wooden table that afternoon in Abuja, their edges crisp, their words final, as ceiling fans hummed lazily above them. Ink dried quickly, but bitterness lingered long after the signatures were done. He rose from his chair lighter, freer, already imagining a future unburdened by compromise. To him, the marriage had ended cleanly on paper. But as he walked out into the heat, sunglasses catching the sun, something else had begun. An urge not just to leave, but to erase. And as the courthouse doors closed behind him, punishment quietly replaced separation as his true intention. Rumors began almost immediately, moving faster than truth ever could. In offices, in church corridors, in family WhatsApp groups, his version of the story traveled with confidence. He painted himself as patient, long-suffering, finally pushed too far. He spoke of her instability, her inability to keep up, her dependence dressed up as love. Each word was chosen carefully, crafted to sound reasonable. People listened because power has a way of commanding belief. And with every lie repeated, her world shrank a little more, connections thinning like thread pulled too tight. Doors that once opened without effort now hesitated. Invitations stopped coming. Friends grew distant, conversations awkward and brief. She felt the shift without needing it explained, sensed the way eyes avoided hers, the way smiles no longer reached people's faces. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was social exile. In Lagos, reputation is currency, and hers had been quietly devalued. She walked familiar streets feeling suddenly foreign, carrying a shame that wasn't hers, wondering how a story she never told had come to define her so completely. He watched all of this from a distance, satisfied. Control, to him, didn't require proximity. It required outcome. Knowing she struggled validated his decision, justified the coldness he pretended was strength. He didn't check on her to offer help. He checked indirectly to confirm damage. When someone mentioned seeing her alone or hinted at her difficulties, it settled him. This was the order of things. The one who leaves rises. The one left fades. Or so he believed, unaware that pressure can either crush or compress something into something stronger. She adapted quietly, learning which rooms no longer welcomed her and which paths offered no resistance. She found work that paid less but demanded more resilience. She learned to stretch meals, to walk instead of ride, to sleep through loneliness without letting it swallow her. Nights were the hardest, when memories pressed close and doubt whispered that maybe the world was right about her. But morning always came, and with it, the stubborn will to stand again. Survival became routine, and routine slowly became strength. In public, she kept her head down, refusing to perform the brokenness expected of her. That restraint confused people. They wanted tears, explanations, something to justify their judgment. But she gave them nothing. Her silence was misread as shame, not knowing it was focus. Every day she lived without his help, without his approval, chipped away at the version of her he had tried to preserve in the past. He didn't see that while he was busy punishing, she was learning how to endure without collapsing. By the time the mud splashed her on that Lagos roadside, the divorce had been over for years. But the punishment had never truly stopped. What he didn't understand was that prolonged cruelty doesn't freeze a person in place. It forces evolution. And as she stood there, soaked but unbowed, the invisible distance between who he thought she was and who she had become had grown dangerously wide. The question was no longer whether she would survive him, but whether he would survive what came next. The sun climbed higher over the Lagos Expressway, heat pressing down as cars rushed past without slowing, their tires hissing against damp asphalt. Mud clung to her dress, already stiffening at the edges, dark patches drying unevenly under the glare. She stood there for a moment longer, not because she didn't know where to go, but because something inside her needed to settle. The city didn't pause. Vendors shouted, buses roared, horns argued with each other. Life kept moving. And in that movement, she realized she had a choice: to react the way pain demanded, or to respond the way survival had taught her. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small handkerchief, wiping her hands slowly, deliberately, as if reclaiming her body from the humiliation forced upon it. Each motion was careful, controlled, grounding. Passers-by glanced at her and looked away, unsure what to make of a woman who refused to collapse in public. Her silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, layered with memories of nights she had already cried through and mornings she had already forced herself to face. This moment didn't deserve tears. It deserved composure. And that composure felt like armor settling into place. A Danfo screeched to a stop nearby, its conductor yelling destinations over the noise. But she didn't rush. She let it pass. Something about chasing after anything, cars, apologies, validation, no longer appealed to her. She adjusted her dress, ignoring the stains, and felt a strange calm spread through her chest. Not peace, not relief, but clarity. The kind that arrives when someone finally understands that begging the past to change only steals energy from the future. That roadside wasn't a place of defeat. It was a boundary she would never cross again. Inside her mind, images flickered quickly. Her former home, the divorce court, the faces that had turned away. They no longer cut as deeply. Time had blunted their edges, not by erasing them, but by teaching her how to carry them without bleeding. Standing there, she made a quiet promise to herself, one without words or ceremony. She would never again measure her worth by how someone else treated her. That promise settled deep, firm and unshakable, reshaping the way she stood, the way she breathed. Traffic thinned slightly as the morning wore on, the city's rhythm changing from frantic to focused. She stepped away from the roadside at last, shoes leaving faint muddy prints that quickly disappeared under dust and movement. Each step felt deliberate, forward-facing, as if she were physically walking away from an old version of herself. She wasn't running from humiliation. She was walking toward something she hadn't named yet, but could feel approaching, slow and certain. Across the city, he laughed loudly with friends over coffee, reenacting the splash with exaggerated gestures, feeding off their amusement. He didn't know that at the exact moment he was mocking her, she was shedding something far more important than mud. He believed silence meant weakness because he had never learned what restraint could do. He mistook calm for surrender, and that misunderstanding would cost him more than he could imagine. As she blended back into the flow of Lagos, her figure disappearing among buses and buildings, the roadside returned to normal, just another stretch of road in a restless city. But something irreversible had happened there. Not to the street, not to the traffic, to her. And while he drove on, convinced he still held power over her story, the truth was forming quietly behind him. The woman he humiliated had just stepped into a strength that didn't need to announce itself, and would soon demand recognition. Whispers began almost immediately, floating through Lagos like heat waves off hot pavement, subtle but relentless. Someone had seen her standing by the roadside, clothes dirty, posture stiff. Someone else added details that weren't there, reshaping the moment into a story that fit their expectations. Laughter followed easily. It always does when a fall confirms what people already want to believe. By evening, her humiliation had been reduced to entertainment, stripped of context, shared without care. The city has a way of watching pain from a distance, convinced that survival belongs only to the loud and the powerful. She felt it before she heard it directly. The shift in tone, the glances that lingered too long, the smiles that didn't reach the eyes. In markets and offices, conversations paused when she entered, then resumed at a lower volume. People didn't ask if she was okay. They assumed they already knew her story. To them, she was a lesson, a warning, proof that losing a husband meant losing protection. No one asked how she kept going. No one wondered what kind of strength it takes to stand alone when a crowd has decided you deserve your pain. He fed the gossip without lifting a finger. His confidence gave the rumors weight, his silence permission. When his name came up, people spoke carefully, respectfully. Power bends narratives. He didn't correct lies because they benefited him. Each distorted retelling reinforced his place above her, reminding everyone who had won. He enjoyed the comfort of being believed without explanation, unaware that reputation built on cruelty is fragile, waiting for the smallest crack to collapse. She moved through this climate quietly, choosing anonymity over defense. Explaining herself felt pointless in a world that preferred spectacle to truth. She learned to shop at different hours, to take longer routes, to exist just outside the spotlight of judgment. It wasn't fear driving her, it was strategy. Attention had already taken enough from her. What she needed now was space to grow without interference, to rebuild where laughter couldn't reach. In Port Harcourt, far from the gossip center, she found a kind of invisibility that felt like relief. There, no one knew her history or her scars. She rented a small place near the river, mornings filled with the smell of water and diesel, evenings quiet enough to hear her own thoughts. The distance gave her perspective. Lagos had laughed because it only saw the fall, not the climb. And climbs, she was learning, are always silent at first. Back in Lagos, the same people who mocked her began to notice subtle shifts they couldn't explain. Mentions of her name came with uncertainty now, laughter softer, questions creeping in. Someone heard she had moved. Someone else heard she was doing well. The certainty that once fueled their cruelty began to erode, replaced by curiosity, then discomfort. Gossip thrives on fixed outcomes. When a story refuses to stay finished, it unsettles everyone watching. As she stood one evening by the Port Harcourt waterfront, breeze lifting her hair, the city lights reflecting across dark water, she felt the distance between who she was and who they thought she was widen completely. Their laughter no longer reached her. What they didn't realize, what he didn't realize, was that communities are quick to mock, but even quicker to retreat when the truth arrives. And that truth was already on its way, moving quietly, carrying a name and a power that would soon force everyone to remember exactly who they had laughed at. Rain tapped softly against the windows of a modest apartment in Port Harcourt, the kind of steady rhythm that invites reflection rather than fear. Inside, the lights were low, casting long shadows across a small dining table where papers lay neatly arranged. She sat upright, hands folded, listening more than speaking, her posture calm but alert. This wasn't a dramatic night.
No celebración. No announcement.
Just a quiet meeting where futures are redirected without noise. The kind of night that looks ordinary to the outside world, but rearranges everything underneath. Across from her, unfamiliar faces carried an authority she recognized immediately. Not loud, not aggressive, just certain. The room smelled faintly of coffee and rain-soaked concrete, grounding the moment in reality. Questions were asked. Answers were measured. She felt the weight of her past without being defined by it. For the first time in years, she wasn't explaining herself to survive. She was being considered, evaluated, taken seriously. And that shift, subtle but undeniable, sent a tremor through her chest she refused to name too early. Hours earlier in Lagos, he had gone to bed satisfied, scrolling through his phone with careless confidence, convinced the world was exactly where he left it. He had no idea that while he slept, decisions were being made that would reach him eventually. His dreams were undisturbed, his certainty intact. He didn't feel the balance shifting because power rarely warns before it changes hands. It simply moves, quietly, efficiently, leaving those who once felt secure unaware until it's too late. Back in the Port Harcourt apartment, the rain slowed, then stopped entirely, leaving the night unusually still. She glanced at the papers again, noticing how ordinary they looked for something carrying so much consequence. No raised voices.
No dramatic promises.
Just a mutual understanding that some stories deserve a second chapter written by different hands. When the meeting ended, there were no hugs, no congratulations, just nods. Respectful. Final. As the door closed behind them, she remained seated, letting the silence settle into something new. She moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside, looking out at the city lights reflecting across wet streets. The air felt different now, heavier but clearer, like the moment just before dawn. She didn't smile. This wasn't joy yet. It was responsibility. Change always arrives dressed like that first, demanding steadiness before offering reward. She understood that whatever had just begun would require restraint, patience, and discretion. The kind of discipline she had learned the hard way. In Lagos, morning arrived as usual, traffic building, radios buzzing with news and music. He stepped out into the day unaware that the ground beneath his confidence had shifted slightly off-center. The world still responded to him the way it always had, reinforcing the illusion that nothing had changed. But unseen forces were already aligning, threads tightening quietly around the future he assumed was secure. As the Port Harcourt sky lightened with the promise of a new day, she folded the papers carefully and placed them out of sight. Nothing about her appearance changed. No new clothes. No visible signs of elevation. That was intentional. Power, she was learning, grows best when it's underestimated. And as she turned off the lights and prepared to sleep, one truth settled firmly into place. The most important transformations don't announce themselves. They wait. And when they finally reveal their presence, they do so on their own terms. Morning light spilled gently into her Port Harcourt apartment, catching dust in the air and turning it briefly into something golden. She moved through the space with quiet purpose, folding clothes, washing a cup, resetting a life that still looked ordinary from the outside. Nothing about her routine screamed transformation. And that was the point. Power hadn't entered her world with luxury cars or loud promises. It arrived as access, as protection, as the freedom to speak without fear.
Subtle things.
Durable things. The kind that don't beg to be noticed. Her days began to change in ways only she could measure. Meetings replaced errands. Conversations carried weight instead of pity. She found herself sitting in rooms where decisions were made, not observed, where her opinions were requested without condescension. Respect followed her quietly, not because of who she had been married to, but because of how she carried herself now. Measured, composed, impossible to dismiss. She didn't rush these moments. Rushing had cost her before. This time, she moved with intention, aware that real influence settles in slowly, like something meant to last. Back in Lagos, he noticed nothing at first. His world continued to reward him. Business deals progressing, social invitations flowing, his name still opening doors. That consistency convinced him he was untouchable. He mistook momentum for permanence. The thought that someone he once controlled could be moving beyond him never crossed his mind. He had built his confidence on comparison, and as long as he believed she was below him, he felt secure. He didn't know the comparison itself was becoming irrelevant. She learned when to speak and when to listen, absorbing lessons from people who wielded authority without raising their voices. In Abuja, during one discreet visit, she observed how influence moved through quiet channels, handshakes that meant more than contracts, pauses that signaled power more clearly than commands. It wasn't glamorous. It was disciplined. She realized then that what she had lost in marriage had been replaced with something far more stable, autonomy backed by respect, not obligation. At night, she reflected on how easily power can be mistaken for noise. She remembered the way he used to dominate rooms, speaking over others, confusing volume with leadership. That kind of power burns fast and leaves nothing behind. What she was building now felt different, cooler, steadier, harder to shake. It didn't rely on fear or control. It relied on alignment. And alignment, she understood, is what makes authority stick when attention fades. He felt occasional flickers of restlessness, moments where satisfaction slipped through his fingers without explanation. He blamed traffic, stress, ambition, anything but himself. The world still treated him well, but something in his victories felt thinner, less satisfying. He didn't recognize it as the beginning of displacement. Power doesn't announce when it's leaving. It simply starts responding to someone else. As she stepped into another meeting, this time in Lagos, her presence drew subtle acknowledgement, nods, space being made, voices lowering. No one needed to say anything out loud. Influence was already doing the work. She remained calm, unassuming, dressed simply, aware that underestimation was now her advantage. And somewhere not far away, the man who once believed he owned her story was still living in the past. Unaware that power had changed clothes, changed hands, and was walking steadily toward him. The first sign that something was wrong came the moment he stepped into the Lagos event hall and felt the room hesitate. Not stop, just shift. Conversations softened. Movements adjusted. It was subtle, the kind of change most people miss unless they're used to being the center of attention. He straightened his jacket automatically, scanning faces, waiting for recognition to settle things back into place. But the energy didn't return to him. It moved past him, forward, toward someone else. And that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. She entered through the side, not announced, not hurried, her presence folding naturally into the space like it belonged there. The same face, the same eyes. But the posture was different, grounded, unafraid, unbothered by who was watching. She didn't search the room for validation. She didn't need to. People noticed her without being prompted, making room, adjusting their stance, lowering their voices slightly. Respect moved ahead of her like a quiet escort. He felt it before he understood it, a tightening in his chest as memory clashed violently with reality. He watched from a distance, confusion sharpening into disbelief. This wasn't the woman from the roadside. This wasn't the ex-wife frozen in his past, stained with mud and humiliation. This version of her carried stillness the way powerful people do, effortlessly, without apology. She didn't glance around nervously or shrink when eyes followed her. She walked as if she knew exactly where she was going and why she was allowed to be there. That confidence hit him harder than anger ever could. The room itself seemed to respond to her. Chairs shifted. Pathways opened. People leaned in when she spoke, not because she was loud, but because she didn't waste words. He noticed hands reaching out to greet her, smiles that were genuine, attentive nods that carried weight. And with every interaction, the version of reality he relied on cracked further. He had built his certainty on the idea that she would always be behind him. Watching her now, he realized she wasn't behind him at all. She was somewhere else entirely. She noticed him eventually, not with shock, not with resentment, but with recognition. A brief pause. A measured glance. Then she continued forward, uninterested in his reaction. That dismissal cut deeper than any confrontation. He wanted acknowledgement, some sign that he still mattered in her world. But she had already moved past him, and that realization landed like a blow. Being hated would have been easier. Being irrelevant was unbearable. His body reacted before his pride could catch up. Shoulders stiffening, jaw tightening, the instinct to reassert himself rising sharply. But the room no longer belonged to him. Every attempt to insert himself felt clumsy, forced, slightly out of sync. He laughed too loudly at one point, the sound falling flat, unsupported. No one mirrored it. No one followed. The power he was used to wielding slipped through his fingers, leaving behind a cold awareness he couldn't shake. As the event unfolded, he stood there watching her move with ease, surrounded by influence he didn't recognize but could feel. And in that moment, something irreversible settled in his chest. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't luck. This was transformation. And the question that haunted him as the evening stretched on wasn't how she had risen, but how long she had been rising without him noticing, and what that meant for everything he thought he controlled. The shift became undeniable when a hush rippled across the Lagos hall, subtle but coordinated, like a signal passing silently from person to person. He followed the movement instinctively, turning toward the source just as an aide stepped forward, posture respectful, voice low but firm. A name was spoken, not shouted, not celebrated, simply stated with a kind of calm authority that doesn't need repetition. And in that instant, the air around him seemed to thin, his breath catching as meaning rushed in faster than his pride could block it. He felt the blood leave his face before his mind fully accepted what he had heard. The title attached to her name landed like a weight on his chest, heavy and undeniable. His heartbeat stumbled, then raced, each thud echoing the memory of muddy water splashing across fabric on a roadside he had already tried to forget. That moment replayed now with cruel clarity, no longer a private victory, but a public mistake. The woman he had humiliated wasn't just respected, she was protected by power far beyond his reach. Around him, people straightened, expressions sharpening with awareness. Conversations recalibrated instantly, aligning themselves with the new reality. He watched hands clasped in formal greetings, watched the careful way people addressed her now, watched the distance others instinctively kept from him as understanding spread. Influence rearranged the room without noise, and for the first time, he stood on the wrong side of it. His certainty cracked audibly inside him, replaced by something unfamiliar and unwelcome: fear. Her reaction was controlled, almost restrained. She acknowledged the attention with a nod, nothing more, as if the title were simply a responsibility she carried, not a trophy she displayed. That composure unsettled him deeply. There was no gloating, no satisfaction visible on her face. The absence of triumph made the reversal sharper, more humiliating. This wasn't revenge. This was consequence unfolding in real time, indifferent to his feelings. His mind scrambled for explanations that could soften the blow. A misunderstanding, a coincidence, a temporary position, anything that could shrink the meaning of what he had just heard. But every detail contradicted him. The way people deferred, the way decisions paused until she acknowledged them, the way authority gathered quietly around her. This wasn't borrowed influence. It was anchored, established, irreversible. And it had grown without his permission, without his awareness. He became painfully aware of his own posture, his own insignificance in that moment. The confidence that usually carried him through rooms deserted him completely. He stood stiff, uncertain where to look, afraid that meeting her eyes would confirm everything his pride still resisted. The city outside continued to glow through glass windows, Lagos alive and indifferent, while his internal world narrowed to a single, suffocating realization. As the event continued, he remained rooted in place, trapped between past and present. The mud he had thrown so casually now felt symbolic, staining memories he couldn't wash away. One name, one title, one truth. It had drained the color from his face and exposed the lie he had lived comfortably for years, that he was untouchable. And as he stood there watching her move with authority, the question tightened around his thoughts like a vice. If this was who she was now, what did that make him? And how much was he about to lose? The laughter that once came easily to him died somewhere between one heartbeat and the next. His mouth opened instinctively, ready to mask confusion with charm, but no sound followed. The room felt colder now, not in temperature, but in tone. Every movement he made seemed louder, clumsier, as if the space itself was rejecting him. Only minutes earlier, he had believed he still belonged among the confident and the untouchable. Now, standing under the same lights, he felt exposed, reduced, and painfully aware that power had shifted without asking his permission. His body betrayed him before his mind could recover. Shoulders that once sat back with ease began to curl inward, protective. His hands fidgeted, adjusting cuffs that suddenly felt too tight. Each breath came shallow, careful, as though he were afraid to take up space that no longer belonged to him. Around him, people recalibrated quickly, their attention redirecting with professional precision. He noticed the subtle distance growing, chairs angling away, conversations resuming without him. Mockery had once been his tool. Now silence turned against him, heavy and judgmental. Across the room, she moved with steady grace, unaware or uninterested in his unraveling. Her calm was unbearable to watch. There was no triumph in her expression, no sign that she even noticed his discomfort. That indifference hurt more than confrontation ever could. Fear crept in quietly, not dramatic or sudden, but persistent. Fear of consequences he couldn't predict. Fear of connections he didn't understand. Fear that the world he had carefully built was no longer aligned in his favor. Memories assaulted him without mercy. The roadside,
The mud.
the smile he wore as he sped away. Those images twisted now, stripped of satisfaction, replaying as warnings he had ignored. Each recollection tightened the knot in his chest. He understood something then that had never occurred to him before. Cruelty feels powerful only until power answers back. And power never forgets the moment it was challenged. He attempted to reclaim control in small ways. Standing taller, forcing a smile, inserting himself into conversations, but every effort landed hollow. His voice sounded wrong to his own ears, lacking the authority it once carried. The room no longer responded to him. Influence had moved on, leaving him performing gestures that meant nothing. Panic simmered beneath his skin, subtle but relentless, like heat trapped beneath glass. She paused briefly near a cluster of people listening, nodding, deciding. He watched as her presence settled outcomes without drama. That was when fear sharpened into certainty. Whatever protection she carried now was real. Whatever reach surrounded her extended far beyond this room. The realization pressed down on him with crushing clarity. He was no longer dealing with an ex-wife. He was facing a force he had underestimated and disrespected. As the events stretched on, his confidence continued to unravel thread by thread. He stayed because leaving would confirm defeat, yet remaining only deepened his discomfort. Every second forced him to sit with the truth he had avoided for years. Mockery had been easy when he believed he was above consequences. Fear arrived the moment he understood he wasn't. And as he stood there, caught between pride and survival, one question burned through his thoughts, refusing to quiet. How does a man outrun the consequences of someone he tried to bury and failed? The moment he finally moved toward her, the room seemed to tighten, as if Lagos itself were holding its breath. His steps were slower now, measured, stripped of the swagger that once announced him before he spoke. The floor beneath his shoes felt unfamiliar, each step reminding him how far he had fallen from certainty. He rehearsed words in his head, softened versions of regret, careful phrases meant to sound sincere. This was unfamiliar territory for him. Apologies had never been his language. Power had always done the talking, but power was no longer answering. Up close, the difference between them felt even sharper. She stood composed, attention split between responsibilities and people who mattered now. Her presence intense when he approached. It didn't react at all. That calm dismantled him faster than anger would have. He sensed that whatever place he once occupied in her emotional world had been sealed shut. Still, he leaned forward slightly, voice lowered, posture deferential, an attempt to signal humility he had never practiced before. His regret arrived clumsily, heavy with urgency but light on substance. It circled the truth without landing on it, skirting responsibility, hinting at misunderstanding instead of ownership. The words sounded right in theory, but they came too late to matter. He wanted absolution without cost, forgiveness without consequence. What he didn't realize was that healing changes the rules. Once someone has rebuilt themselves without you, your remorse becomes irrelevant. She listened briefly, not out of obligation, but out of courtesy. Her eyes held no anger, no satisfaction, only distance. The kind of distance created when someone has already mourned what they lost and moved on. That was when it hit him hardest. He hadn't just lost power. He had lost access. Whatever he was apologizing for belonged to a version of her that no longer existed. The room continued around them, indifferent to his internal collapse. Decisions were being made elsewhere. Conversations carried on. Life refused to pause for his realization. He understood then that redemption isn't something you claim when fear arrives. It's something you earn before consequences do. And he had missed that window entirely. She shifted her attention back to the people waiting for her, a subtle but final signal. There was no dramatic dismissal, no cutting words. Just forward motion. He stood there momentarily, suspended in the space between who he used to be and who he was becoming against his will. The apology he carried had nowhere to land. As she walked away, the truth settled with brutal clarity. Some doors close quietly, without slamming, without warning. Not because of pride or vengeance, but because survival required it. And as he watched her disappear into a world he no longer belonged to, one question echoed painfully in his chest. When forgiveness is no longer available, what is a man left with but the weight of his own choices? The night air outside the Lagos venue felt heavier than before, thick with exhaust fumes and unfinished thoughts as he stepped into it alone. The city moved on effortlessly, traffic flowing, lights blinking, laughter spilling from passing cars. Indifferent to the collapse happening inside him. Somewhere between the curb and his parked car, the image returned one final time. Muddy water rising, splashing, staining. What had felt like a small, private victory now loomed large, replaying with brutal clarity. That moment had not disappeared. It had matured, and now it stood tall enough to confront him. He leaned against his car, palms flat on the metal, grounding himself as the truth settled in layers. Power doesn't announce when it's abused. It records. It waits. Every act of cruelty he once dismissed as harmless had been stored quietly, gaining weight with time. The humiliation he inflicted so casually had not destroyed her. It had revealed him, and standing there under the glow of streetlights, he understood that consequences don't rush. They arrive precisely when escape feels impossible. Across the city, she returned to her routine without spectacle.
No celebration.
No reflection on him. Her life no longer required his presence, his apology, or his acknowledgement. The strength she carried now wasn't born from revenge, but from survival sharpened into clarity. She had learned that dignity grows when you stop asking for permission to heal. And in choosing forward motion over fixation, she ensured that her future would never again be shaped by someone else's cruelty. The story, however, didn't belong only to them. Lagos remembered. Communities always do. The same people who laughed had grown quiet, their certainty shaken. Power has a way of forcing reflection long after judgment has been passed. And slowly, the narrative corrected itself, not with drama, but with discomfort. People began to understand that humiliation isn't entertainment. It's a test. And not everyone passes. For him, the lesson lingered without resolution. There was no punishment dramatic enough to balance the scales, no public reckoning to cleanse the past. Just memory. Just awareness. Just the understanding that the world he once dominated no longer responded to him the same way. That kind of loss doesn't heal quickly. It humbles slowly, painfully, one realization at a time. She, meanwhile, continued forward unburdened. The mud had long since washed away, but the meaning of that day remained, not as a scar, but as proof. Proof that power abused always circles back. Proof that silence can be preparation. Proof that the person you try to reduce may one day stand where you cannot reach. And so the lesson remained, written clearly for anyone willing to see it. Humiliation travels fast, but consequences travel farther. And sometimes, the person you tried to bury doesn't come back for revenge. They come back as a reminder of exactly who you were when you thought no one was watching.